Good morning. Chief Moore, welcome. And we'll have other colleagues who will be joining us. This is an important hearing on the fiscal year 2024 President's budget for the United States Forest Service. It's great to have you with us. This is our first hearing of the year. I'm excited that the leadership on the full committee, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins, are working in a bipartisan manner to move our appropriation bills down the fiscal year 2024 path through committee and to the floor. They believe our committee members have a lot of shared bipartisan priorities that will power us through to enact appropriation bills this year, and I think it is so important that we try to establish that rhythm. I think we all agree that a continuing resolution or government shutdown would be a disaster. So we're ready to get to work, and here we are at our first hearing. I know a lot has been made of the split between the defense and non-defense funding. It's something we grapple with every year. I feel strongly that if we want to build a safer, more competitive country, we can't give up on the need to invest right here at home. And funding for the Forest Service is a perfect example of why we need to invest in non-defense spending. Defend our communities from wildfire, improve public health, protect jobs, increase the health and resiliency of our forests. Indeed, the budget request for fiscal year 2024 gives us another stark reminder that our forests are in peril and that we need these investments. We know that climate chaos is unrelenting. It's working through a cast of henchmen, drought, invasive pests, diseases that together are causing inevitable scourge of catastrophic wildfire. And we can no longer view these villains as natural disasters. What they really are human-caused, unnatural disasters brought on by our collective failure to effectively confront climate chaos and the carbon dioxide that is warming the planet. When these unnatural disasters strike, people lose their homes, they lose their livelihood, they even lose their lives. People who live even hours away lose their municipal water source, suffer the health impacts of the smoke and the particulate matter in the air, and lose the joy of recreation and the peace of nature. I will never forget traveling on Labor Day 2020 over 600 miles from the northern border to the southern border of Oregon and back again, and never getting out of the smoke. And seeing town after town after town burned to the ground. It looked like World War II firebombed cities, and it has really affected the psychology of my state and concern of folks about increasing their effort to increase the resilience, the fire resilience of the forest through thinning, through mowing, through prescribed fire, and try to minimize the chance of these types of catastrophes happening again. Everywhere I go in Oregon, I hear people say, let's do everything we can to make the forest more resilient, to defend our communities, keep our towns from being wiped out by blowtorch-style fires. And preventing these catastrophes is much better than investing on the back end. Looking back over the last 10 years, we have about doubled our annual investments in the Forest Service. In fiscal year 2013, funding was $4.5 billion, of which $2.1 billion was for fighting fires and $2.4 for other forest management activities. 10 years later, fiscal year 2023 is $8.2 billion. So that's a big change over a decade. $4.3 billion for fire and $3.9 billion for forest management. The entire pot is growing, but certainly firefighting costs just continue to rise exponentially. So we need to double down on other forest management activities critical to forest resilience and forest health: watershed and habitat restoration, control of invasive species, thinning prescribed burns, grants to states for their best efforts. There are three major pieces of legislation that will provide an additional $12.6 billion over the course of a decade on top of that annual funding. That will enable us to radically step up our campaign to reinvigorate the resiliency of our forested lands. The Great American Outdoors Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act. All three provide transformative investment. Of course, they're not permanent, so we have to make the best use of every bit of those funds while they exist. And focusing only on responding to wildfires does not and will not help us take care and restore our forests for the future. So we have to bring balance to our forests through collaboration. We need to work across the lines the divisions of the timber wars of the past. I have to say, in Oregon, groups collaboration has greatly expanded, bringing together the timber community, the environmental community, the local stakeholders to work on the management of the forest. And that's why it's really such a success, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. We have many collaboratives in Oregon, but now 5 that are part of the federal program and others that would like to be. They bring science-based ecosystem restoration, and when those various groups can work out a prescription for how to thin or treat the forest, their trust grows in each other. It gets easier over time, and the result is effective treatment of the forest, but also saw logs to the mill and projects that are staying out of the courts. So that hazardous fuels reduction continues to be very important. And between the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress has invested more than $3 billion in the Forest Service's hazardous fuels work. Huge increase over what we were doing a decade ago. It'll at least double the impact of what we've done even with just annual funds, annual budgets alone. The Forest Service is prioritizing multiple high-risk areas in Oregon with these funds, around Mount Hood in the north, Malheur National Forest in the east, in central Oregon, and in the Klamath Basin. There are other areas that need more treatment, like the Rogue Valley and areas outside the wildland-urban interface, but those programs aren't designed, those programs weren't designed to deliver to. So we'll keep pushing for hazardous fuels reduction in the Interior bill to keep up the momentum. One of the things I've talked to the Forest Service about is where the location is of the acres that have gone through the environmental process and are ready for treatment. And those acres are often not near the towns because they're often the ones that were kind of the cheapest per acre to do. And this is why we really have to push to map the acres around our most vulnerable towns and how we thin and treat those forests. Even if they're more expensive per acre, it's more important to slow down the fire close to town than it is far away. The budget also proposes a new program. It's a program, actually I can't say it's really new in that we funded it in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, but it will be new to our annual appropriations, and that's the burned area rehabilitation. And when we see things like the bootleg fire in Oregon, we see just how important that is. Post-wildfire restoration, improving the watershed and forest conditions over a 3-year period after a fire. Finally, touching back on wildland fire, I appreciate the significant investment that the President proposes to properly support the federal wildland firefighting force. This effort really began with passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, which boosted the pay of firefighters and built a more professional, year-round firefighting workforce. And we're really looking at the model of how to keep people employed year-round so that when they're not fighting fires, they can be doing forest treatments and thereby not have the massive turnover and really retain the expertise that are developed. Our efforts in the Interior Appropriations Bill have built a more permanent backbone to sustain those investments. It is a credit to you, Chief Moore, for not just proposing better pay for firefighters, but also proposing investments in their health and life-work balance. Life-work balance, that's something we struggle with here all the time. Our firefighters need support to combat the real danger of injury and fatigue, another consequence of the more catastrophic wildfires and never-ending fire seasons. While we need our authorizing committees to establish a special salary table and other compensation reforms, we stand ready to continue working toward a better cared for firefighting workforce. Chief, I appreciate that the request continues the Wildfire Reserve Fund at the authorized level of $2.65 billion. I am concerned that the levels agreed to in 2018 may no longer be adequate based on the trend of wildfire costs in the years since. So this is why we have included additional $450 million for wildfire suppression in the fiscal year 23 omnibus. Depending on what happens with the fires this coming summer, it may be very important for us to be able to do so again. And so kind of I'm looking towards the vision of planning for that. And then if it's not needed, though, that would be great. But we just don't know how this year is going to play out yet. Got a lot of intensive firefighting months to come. So I hope we'll have the administration's support for doing so. With all that, I'll have a few questions about the investments after your presentation. I'm sure my colleagues will as well. And now I'll turn to Senator Murkowski, the co-chair, for any opening comments she would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be back at work here on the Interior Environment and related agencies, and to kick off our hearings with the Chief of the Forest Service. So welcome to you. You have appropriately focused on the issues related to wildland fires and the impact that we see across the country, and certainly appreciate the challenges that faces from a budget perspective, and how we do right there. Before I turn, though, to speak about some of those issues and the specifics in the FY24 President's budget request, Chief, I just want you to hear directly from me, again, on the record, my disappointment with the administration's decision regarding the management of the Tongass National Forest, our nation's largest national forest. This January, this administration reinstated again the 2001 National Roadless Rule on the Tongass National Forest, basically abandoning the Alaska-specific rule and all the data and all the analysis that had supported it. So now, rather than providing the access needed to responsibly harvest timber, minimal amounts of timber, I might add, as well as developing other natural resources on a fraction of the nearly 17 million acres within the Tongass, the administration has made it virtually impossible to have a sustainable regional economy there, which is a far cry from what Secretary Vilsack promised me and the Alaska delegation when he talked about a transition to harvesting young growth timber, in which he said the Tongass was going to retain a small but a viable timber industry. That was the commitment there. We have come so far from that commitment, unfortunately. And it seems, sadly, that all those years of work by good people has been cast aside. And it's especially bitter for those who took an early leap of faith, collaborated with the agency, with the environmental groups and the tribes, and invested in this promised transition. So all this work, all the timber program in the Tongass is effectively all but dead. I have long said that I do not believe that we have to choose between a healthy forest and a healthy economy. I just continue to be amazed that the administration does not agree that Southeast Alaska can and should be allowed to have both. So, Chief, I'm just going to ask you once again to work with me to provide some level of opportunity for the people of Southeast Alaska. I'll be addressing that more in my questions to follow here. But as the chairman has pointed out, certainly fire is at the top of his list of worries. Certainly for us in Alaska, it is as well. Last year, in my state, we had the fastest start to the wildfire season on record, with over 1 million acres burning in June alone. By July, that number leapt to well over 2 million acres. So we're seeing this. We're seeing this impact. Climate change is certainly manifesting itself through these wildfire threats, and we're seeing them undoubtedly evolve. All you need to do is drive through the Mat-Su Valley or down on the Kenai Peninsula to see the impact of the beetle kill, the threat of fire that it poses to our Alaskan communities. I know that my colleagues in the lower 48 are dealing with similar tree mortality issues. They've been long battling drought. So I, too, am going to be interested in the wildfire outlook and what the planning for this year looks like. One thing I do want to applaud the Forest Service for is working collaboratively with the Department of Interior on a proposal to modernize and reform wildland fire workforce pay. It's so important that we make the pay competitive with other firefighting agencies, as well as doing things like investing in housing, investing in mental health. We owe it to our frontline firefighters to have a plan, have a strategic plan to help them and really to care for them as they engage in this dangerous line of work. In addition to more full-time permanent wildland firefighters across the country, each of my colleagues who interact with the Forest Service are surely going to be identifying their agency needs in their states. In Alaska, we need increased capacity to facilitate our robust recreation industry. You hear me talk about the need for those permits, support for critical mineral mining projects in the region, broadband access, and of course, again, a timber supply for our withering timber industry. And we believe that we must empower our tribes to be partners with the federal government as they are critical to expanding that capacity. And so that's why I'm interested in hearing not only how the budget request proposes to address these capacity issues, but also what the Forest Service is actually doing right now to address them, especially in light of the billions of dollars in annual appropriations, what we've included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. The agency has received a lot of money going in that direction, so interested in knowing what are we seeing, how are we seeing those dollars translate into action. Also looking forward to hearing about your vision for the President's FY24 budget request and to learn more about your priorities for the Forest Service and how those priorities can improve the health and resilience of our nation's forests. So thank you for being here this morning. Looking forward to the opportunities for questions back and forth. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Chief Moore, we'd like to hear from you.
Okay, great, thank you. Chair Merkley, Ranking Member Murkowski, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I appreciate the opportunity to share how the Forest Service is putting America's money to work. The fiscal year 24 request focuses on three primary areas: modernizing the wildland fire management system, confronting the wildfire crisis, and ensuring equitable access to and benefits from National Forest System. The people we serve deserve nothing less than to see the value of their money at work and to see their benefits. National forests and grasslands cover about 193 million acres. Some 180 million people and over 68,000 communities rely on these lands to capture and filter their drinking water. Our work contributes to over 373,000 jobs, $40.3 billion to the GDP. We work with tribes, we work with states and local governments, private landowners, and many other partners across the country to keep forests and grasslands healthy and safe. Today, America's forests face dire threats from wildfire, climate change, and insects and disease, particularly in the West. This is an emergency situation in many places, and we're acting with a sense of urgency in collaboration with communities and with our partners. Our top priority is to reduce wildfire threats by safeguarding communities and critical infrastructure and creating healthy and resilient forests. Through our wildfire crisis strategy, we've ramped up to treat the right places at the right scale using an all lands, all hands approach. This past January, we announced investments of $930 million in 21 high-risk landscapes in the West, benefiting roughly 200 communities and many other resources that people value. In addition, we've awarded nearly $200 million in community wildfire defense grants towards 100 projects to 22 states and 7 tribes, including $22.5 million in Oregon. Recent investments by Congress give us a historic opportunity to take bold and strategic actions. We're working to do just that, to put every dollar to good use. We're grateful to Congress and this committee in particular for investing foundational funding to do this work. Sustained execution depends on continued federal investments. The proposed FY24 budget responds to this need. This budget also calls for a $1.4 billion investment in salaries, health, safety, and well-being for firefighters. A suite of new actions will permanently increase pay, improve options for housing, and provide better care and support for physical and mental health. It also increases the number of firefighters. While firefighters represent the backbone of our wildfire system, we also need active and aggressive land management to confront the wildfire crisis. This budget invests $300 million in hazardous field treatments. It supports execution of the wildfire crisis strategy. It targets investments in burn area rehabilitation for $56 million to expedite recovery on wildfire. It supports use of the latest research, including grants and including granting grants to universities to support educational and technical assistance for innovative wood products. National forests and grasslands belong to every American. We're grateful for the Great American Outdoor Act funds that reduced our $7.7 billion maintenance backlog and ensure increase for public access. We're also investing bipartisan infrastructure law funds to repair historic cabins in Alaska. Every person should feel a personal invitation and connection to these lands. We remain committed to removing barriers so all people can enjoy National Forest System lands and services, particularly tribes and underserved community. We continue to focus policies, accountability, and training to ensure an equitable, respectful, and harassment-free work environment for all of our employees. We know what's at stake if we don't address the effects of climate change and the wildfire crisis. The health of our forests and communities, clean water, a vibrant wood products industry, and jobs and resources that Americans depend on. We need to act now to meet the challenges before us. Thank you, and I am grateful for your support, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Chief Moore. And we're going to have, I think, seven-minute rounds of questions, and we'll be able to go back through. And a special welcome to Katie Britt. Good to have you on the subcommittee. Let's dive into that firefighter workforce issue. Last year, the Forest Service target for firefighters was 11,300. How close did you get to that target, and what did we learn about that challenge that will help us improve recruitment for this coming year?
Senator, we got about 10,965, or roughly 97% of that goal of 11,300 firefighters. What we learned is that, because of the pressures of recruitment and retention, that we were facing really an uphill battle. I would be happy to tell you that the proposed FY24 President's budget addresses a lot of the concerns and challenges we had with recruitment and retention.
So one of the issues I keep hearing about is housing. Any insights on that?
Yeah, in the President's budget, it does address a number of things. It addresses the housing issue, so we have money set aside there, about $45 million. It also looks at about $10 million for the Forest Service and $10 million for the Department of Interior to look at mental care and well-being. And it also addresses, just the challenges with the pay gap between federal and non-federal firefighters. So we think it addresses a number of those issues that was really affecting our ability to recruit, retain a lot of our firefighters going forward.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've talked about is trying to increase the workforce by not having the interruption of folks being on fires and then having to figure out the rest of their life during the non-fire season, and thus the potential synergy between being a firefighter role and being in the role of forest management. What do you see as the prospects or possibilities for that helping to increase retention from year to year?
Well, my experience, working in the Forest Service for 40-plus years, it varied over the years. Lately, what we're seeing is the primary reason that I've been hearing personally from firefighters is the pay gap. It's easier when you're beginning firefighter. It used to be easier, I should say. But as you get older and have families, the salaries become even more important. And Forest Service salaries, I should say federal salaries in many of the locations across the country is not holding up to salaries in other non-federal jobs. When you have a minimum pay of $15 per hour, you would have to be a minimum of a GS5 to be comparable to that minimum wage. In many of our locations, the minimum wage is not enough to sustain a fair way to live. And we're seeing more and more of that pop up, particularly across the West, but it certainly holds true all across the country where the cost of living is continuing to rise and our salaries are staying fairly the same.
So last year, we set the floor at $15, but are there plans for it to go higher than that?
Well, what happened, that it's a temporary fix. We looked at about a $20,000 bump in pay. That stemmed the tide of a lot of our employees leaving. I think the challenge now is that if that is permanent, which is proposed in the President's FY24 budget, we think that that's going to be a huge help. One of the other things we have, in addition to the health and well-being of our employees, is looking at the housing issue that we're trying to address, which we have a severe shortage in many of our small rural locations across the country. We think that the budget that's proposed really addresses that issue. And then the other piece that I think is really significant, which I think will make a huge difference, is what we call portal-to-portal pay. And not only does that pertains to our full-time firefighters, but it's also what we call the militia workforce in the Forest Service. It's our wildlife biologists, our foresters who have certifications in certain parts of the fire program that goes out to fight and suppress fires. And that would pertain to all employees that have qualifications and certifications to participate in fire suppression activities.
So I want to shift gears. The Bipartisan Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act provided for investment in high-risk fire sheds, and the Forest Service has targeted areas of my state of Oregon in the north, southeast, and central Oregon. The Rogue Valley is considered our highest risk fire shed, and it is not targeted by the Forest Service in part because there's not a lot of Forest Service land there. It's a lot of BLM land and other multiple land ownership. The Forest Service does, however, have other funds that are available to work with states, with private landowners for cross-boundary work with BLM. Is that flexible enough to provide help with the Rogue Valley fire shed?
Yeah, Senator, I'm glad you asked that question because it comes up fairly often. And, you know, we, of course, have focused on the 21 landscapes that have been identified, but we have other dollars in the budget where we work in other areas that are also at high fire risk or those important areas. The collaborative, we call it CFLRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, is one of those areas where we have community of people coming together to look at those areas that are important, and those projects or programs are funded. So we have a lot of work that's been done outside of the 21 landscapes that really gets at the issue of reducing not only the potential high fire danger, but also for disease and insects and some of the other types of issues that we're dealing with in our forests today. We, the Secretary of Vilsack just announced earlier this week $197 million for community wildfire defense grants. 6 of those grants have been awarded in Southern Oregon, which goes directly into the areas that you mentioned.
And thank you very much.
For the tune of $22.5 million. And so the point that I'm making is that we have other opportunities to work in other areas outside of the 21 landscapes because we know that there are some important issues all across the National Forest System, and that's why we're maximizing and utilizing our dollars to the best. Now, the other thing that I would just add on this particular piece, too, is that, you know, we are trying to leverage every dollar we get with partner matching contributions. And so far, our work with our partners has really exceeded even the amount of money that we're getting now, whether it's through bill, IRA, or the appropriated budgeted process, and even GAOA dollars. You didn't ask this question, but I'll say that even through GAOA dollars, our partners has brought in an additional $200 million towards backlog and deferred maintenance and restoration efforts.
Great. Thank you. Well, forest issues are certainly an issue in Oregon and also in Alaska, and so we'll turn to Senator Murkowski as ranking member.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I want to start my questions with some of the issues associated with tree mortality. As you know, we've been hit really hard in Alaska with spruce bark beetle. It's been observed on roughly 193,500 acres statewide, more than 98% of those acres mapped in 2020 one being in south central Alaska, which of course is where our population is concentrated. The outbreak is estimated to be now in its 7th year. It's affected over 1.6 million acres since first being documented in 2016. It was around a lot earlier than that, but I think that was when we started really mapping it. But it is a huge issue, and one that we pay close attention to it because of what it means for not only the mortality, but then what that might mean as regards to a fire threat. How is Forest Service utilizing the funding that we provided here through Congress to address the outbreak in Alaska? I thought that we were going to be a little more competitive, perhaps, in the Community Wildfire Defense Program grant, and especially in view of the vast need that we have. But I've learned that only one community in Alaska has received benefits from that grant. So how do you get money to communities in these areas where the beetle kill really does pose significant threat? And if there's a challenge with the way we've written that, let me know. So if you can speak to some of the threat that we're seeing with the spruce bark beetle.
Sure, Senator Murkowski, you're correct. The outbreak of the beetle has been devastating there in Alaska. Well, what we're seeing is a little bit of a challenge, because a change, because even though last year's look, it was 198,000 acres or so, we also did aerial survey analysis for fiscal year 22 last year, and what we are seeing is a rapid decline in the amount of acres that's being affected. In fact, we only saw about 48,000 acres compared to 197 the year before. But even saying that, we have been working with some of the locals there, putting together a plan, and we are planning to work together to look and see if there's really a continued concern of the beetle, or has it reached its peak. So we're going to be monitoring that very closely, but what we're seeing is a trend down currently. In terms of the wildfire community defense grants, this was only the first round. We'll have many more rounds coming up. In fact, this was the first $197 million. We have an additional $800 million where we're going to be looking at opportunities to do a lot of work, and so I'm sure Alaska will fit into some of those future projects.
So it's not necessarily a question of the criteria for the grants themselves. Was it a matter of how much was allocated in that first round? And Alaska, it's inconceivable to me. I mean, when you talk about 1.6 million acres of a beetle kill, it seems to me that our communities would be eligible for more than one of these community grant programs. So if there's an issue with how we're competing for those, let's talk about it. If it's an issue that we haven't done much to provide for a bigger grant funding pool, let's talk about that. Or if it's, again, the criteria, is it based on population that might be impacted? Well, I will share with you, and if you haven't seen it, it's just driving down the road. Right. Driving down the road. Let me ask, though, because I'm talking about the impact in South Central because of the spruce bark beetle. But down in the Tongass, we just, spruce bark beetle really hasn't been a significant threat or concern. And in just the past few years now, we've seen the black-headed budworm that is just absolutely wreaking havoc on the coastal hemlock and the spruce down there in southeast. So this is new for us. And what we're seeing, it's traveling like wildfire. And what you look at as you're on the coast or flying above, you can visually see the movement there. Nobody's really talking about it, but it is an outbreak that I'm really concerned about. And again, as we're seeing warmer temperatures, we never used to worry about wildfire in the Tongass because the Tongass is a rainforest. Well, that rainforest is not always wet. And if we're seeing this level of mortality brought about by a different invasive species, what's the plan here?
So, Senator, we do have our researchers looking at that area, particularly with the outbreak of insects as well as diseases there in the area. So we'll be paying close attention to that, and we'll be working with the community there. So we have not and will not forget Alaska and how it fits into having some of these opportunities to get these grant proposals. And like I said, this first round was really looking at high wildfire potential, and I hear you that there's potential there that didn't used to be there, particularly since it's supposed to be a rainforest, but it's, you know, not every year is the same. But just know that we're paying attention to Alaska. We do intend, and I would say that for sure that there would be an opportunity to fund some of those areas in Alaska. This was really only the first go-round, and we were really focused on high fire danger and potential areas there. The other thing that, and Alaska is starting to do this, is working with community leaders, looking at areas to focus on. And so when you're applying for these grants, we're looking to see what the state has done to map out some of these areas. And where this first go-round, it went, a lot of those projects went to states that have already done a lot of the mapping throughout the state. Alaska is working on that now. We have a group there that we're working with, and I'm confident that Alaska will be competitive going forward.
Well, Chief, my time has expired, but I do want to impress upon you that right now the community leaders, the mayors of the borough of the Kenai Peninsula, as well as within the Anchorage area, they're coming to me not for more in appropriations, because they're not counting on that. They're counting on me for congressionally directed spending. They want me to take care of their number one priority, which is the fire threat to their region. Very immediate, very real. And so I would ask that we have a little better understanding in terms of what more we can be doing to help these threatened communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Britt.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. It is a pleasure to be with you all today. Chief Moore, appreciate you being in front of this committee and the important work that you do. I also want to say thank you for sending me a welcome letter and welcoming me, obviously, to the Senate and to this committee. I certainly look forward to being able to work with you. As you know, forests are incredibly important to Alabama. They are one of the main reasons our state is known by many as Alabama the Beautiful. Alabama is home to over 23 million forest land acres, the third most in the continental United States. The people of Alabama are hard at work putting that land to good use. In fact, forestry contributes to over 100,000 jobs in our state. All of the work leads to a total economic output of about $27.7 billion. The state produces almost every wood product you could possibly imagine, from lumber to paper to cabinetry to pellets to flooring to oriented strand board. These products are used by Alabamians, by our neighbors, and all across the globe. Thankfully, we are able to export about $1.3 billion in products overseas. With an industry this productive and resources so crucial to our state, Alabama forest owners know that we have to take care of the gift that God gave us. And the greater forestry community in Alabama has demonstrated that principle incredibly well. Private landowners know that they must take care of their land if they are going to leave things better than they found them, leave things better for their kids and their grandkids. And as I consistently say, there are no greater stewards of our lands than our farmers, foresters, and cattlemen. I think that's why over 91% of Alabama's forests are privately owned, and the state still continues to add 2 to 2.5% of tree volume year over year. The administration's fiscal year 2024 budget for the Forest Service includes $60 million to install charging equipment for electric vehicles on public lands, which is clear that the Green New Deal has certainly made its way into the Forest Service budget. However, that very same budget cuts $3 million from landscape scale restoration grant funding. I believe this funding obviously has supported efforts to reduce wildlife fire risk, it's improved forest conditions, and also mitigated disease and blight conditions that are facing our nation's forest. In Alabama, we have found these funds to be useful to expand the use of drones and train drones pilots to combat and prepare for forest fires. In your experience, how effective have we been in using drones to track the spread of forest fires, to use that information to assist us as we fight forest fires and their efforts in the future?
So, Senator Britt, again, welcome and thank you for the question. I might add, too, in terms of wood innovations, one of the things that we bragged about Alabama last week was that you also have a cross-laminated timber facility there as well. And so I know Georgia would like to have their own, but right now they're borrowing from Alabama. So good on Alabama.
Yeah, we're proud to be a leader.
Yeah, the other part of your question, though, I think that I think Alabama, but as well as the South in general, plays prominently in how we look at wood and how we look at the innovations of wood, but also looking at the use of drones. The Forest Service has just recently gotten into the use of drones to do a lot of different types of forest management, including wildfire suppression, prescribed burning as well. In fact, we call it the Southern region is right now is leading the nation in prescribed burning, but also using drones to help with that facility. We know that there's always a safety risk when we use helicopters to look at increasing the amount of prescribed burning we're doing. And so one of the alternatives to mitigate that safety issue is to look at drones to do prescribed burning. So we're moving into that arena in a really rapid way, and we have already started licensing and certifying a lot of our employees to operate the drones. And so we're headed in that direction, and we're going as quick as we possibly can.
Well, thank you. I hope that we continue to use those resources to make smart decisions moving forward. And I want to thank you for the work that you and the Forest Service continue to put into Alabama and helping keep Alabama beautiful and obviously protecting the many livelihoods that you just referenced yourself. I was happy to see the emphasis you placed when you wrote me that welcome letter on collaboration and working to avoid these catastrophic events, wildfires and other things in areas like Alabama that would require robust local engagement to make good land management decisions. And so the Forest Service received about $10 billion in FY 2023. How are you using those funds to address and mitigate threats of cross-boundary fires, that start on federal lands and obviously cross over into private forest?
One of the strategies and the plans we have in the wildfire crisis strategy that we've developed is to look at two pieces. We have said that we want to address 20 million acres of federal lands, of Forest Service lands, as a matter of fact, but an additional 30 million acres of other federal, tribal, and private lands throughout the country. And so when we look at addressing to scale, we're looking at landscapes. And when we look at landscapes, it's multiple jurisdictions.
Okay.
And so we want to be able to deploy the work in a way where it's effective. So we'll be looking at strategically placed treatments across the landscape. In fact, our scientists are telling us that when you look at a fire shed as an example, which is about a 250,000 acre block, we only need to treat anywhere between 20 to 40% of that to have a positive effect on how that fire behaves when it moves through that fire shed.
Okay.
And so we're looking at that. We're using science as a foundation for making decisions on how we approach that. And we also know that the only way forward is to do it in a collaborative manner where we invite the community of people into the decision space to talk about what we need to do out there together. And so that's the direction that we headed in. We know that we need to invite the people into the decision space, not just, in the position of giving us their recommendation, but making them a part of the deciding what the problem is, defining what the problem, but also helping to pursue the solution together as well.
No, I certainly appreciate that spirit of collaboration and letting everybody have a seat at the table. I see that my time is expired, and so I will submit my additional questions for the record, Mr. Chairman.
And if you have the time to stay, approximately 15 minutes from now, you'll get another opportunity.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. Thank you, Senator Britt. So I want to jump into the complexity of the funding to fight fires. We have the base funding, we have the reserve fund, we have the supplemental, and we have carryover, all of which can get very confusing. But the reserve fund is set up under legislation that essentially increases it by $100 million a year. So FY24 request is 2.650 rather than 2.550. And is it, given the accelerating costs of the wages, the investments in housing, the expansion of the fire season, the increased number of acres being burned, is that enough, or do we need to fix the fire fix?
I think first of all, I want to thank Congress for the fire fix, because it certainly helped in terms of limiting our ability and really stopping our ability to use other non-fire dollars to use toward fire suppression when we've exceeded the cap. So we'll always be grateful and thankful to Congress for the fire funding fix. What we are seeing, though, over the last 3 years, 2 of those years, we've exceeded $3 million for fire suppression. And when we looked at that legislation, Senator, we had no idea that we would reach this point this early in time. And we already are getting forecasts from our researchers telling us that by between now and fiscal year 27, that we're going to be seeing those costs exceed or up to $4 million per year for fire suppression. And so if that continues and if the legislation expires, then we may be returning back to fire borrowing as we did in the past, which would really be devastating to all of the efforts that we're trying to put forward now, looking at trying to reduce the wildfire crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. We're determined to try to prevent that fire borrowing, which is why we're keeping the window open for a supplemental of another $450 million. When you have to shut down all the other things you do and then wait for us to do an emergency supplemental to refund you before you can pick up your other responsibilities, that's just unacceptable in terms of the stewardship and management of our forests. The Civilian Conservation Corps folks, and we've got a number of them in Oregon, and they really give a second chance to a lot of folks 16 through 24 who are looking to get their feet back on the ground after maybe going off track. And the forest programs are quite significant and popular. They can be paid when they work fighting fires, but they are not, the Forest Service is not authorized to pay them when they do non-fire work in terms of forest stewardship, forest maintenance, and yet they're working right alongside others who are getting paid. Do you support Congress giving you the authority so these folks can be paid when they're doing forest management as well as when they're doing firefighting?
Yeah, Senator, I would always support justice and equality. We currently have limited authority to compensate Job Corps students, primarily because they're not federal employees, they're not contractors, nor are they part of a non-government organization. So our staff and our legal counsel right now are completing their review of the proposed language, and we'll be responding shortly back to you on suggested edits if needed.
Great. We look forward to your suggestions on that area. I want to turn to tribal co-management. The Klamath tribe in the southern part of Oregon, their reservation was taken back by the government when the tribe was terminated. The tribe was restored, but they did not get their reservation back, but they would like to have co-management ability on the Wainema. And the Warm Springs tribe would like to be able to do that on the Mount Hood Forest. What can we do to actually implement significant co-management work that I find completely appropriate and valuable?
Yeah, I would like for you to know that I share your perspective on this. We have increased the number of shared stewardship agreements with tribes. We are looking at plenty of other opportunities where we can co-manage some of our facilities. We're looking at one now up on the Pactola, up in South Dakota, as an opportunity to co-manage that particular area there. So it's going to take time, but we agree with that philosophy, that approach, that we would like to do more working together with the tribes.
Good. Well, I really hope we can see that unfold. I think it would be a very significant to the tribe. After all, these forests are on the traditional tribal lands, and they bring they have high unemployment rates. They have a lot of time immemorial forest management knowledge to bring to bear, and so it could be a real win-win. You had mentioned the work on staff housing, but right now it's just kind of a line item. I mean, we have buildings that have to be reopened, or we have to build new buildings. Is there a detailed plan? And certainly without places where people can stay or afford to stay, it's very hard to locate in a lot of our rural areas where the Forest Service does its work.
Yeah, Senator, I'll check to see if we have a detailed plan, but we know that we have a lot of housing facilities that need some significant remodeling and investing in. And I'm happy to report that the President's budget has put aside $50 million to look at this issue. And we think that that's going to go a long ways in restoring a lot of our facilities.
Great. I look forward to a detailed plan on how we can use that effectively to expand the availability, because I'm just hearing from everyone that that's, in terms of hiring people, retaining them in remote areas, it's almost impossible if there's no place to live. Somehow the prospect of just working for the Forest Service while you live in your car is not such an entertaining one. I noted with interest a recent request for proposals from the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky, where they required that all proposed designs utilize mass timber. Mass timber is a very significant product in Oregon, and it sequesters carbon in buildings. It has more earthquake resistance. It really is a fabulous kind of engineering advance. How about we make this requirement for all the Forest Service RFPs?
Well, if Congress decides to do that, we'll certainly give it our best shot to make it happen.
Well, I think it's actually something that you would have the power to do it without legislation, just as we've seen the model in Kentucky. But I'll keep raising it. Thank you. Let me turn to Senator Murkowski.
I'd like to defer to also another new member of our committee. It's nice to have Senator Fisher on, so before I go to my second round, I'll defer to her.
A pleasure to have you, Senator Fisher. Sorry I didn't look over and see you had arrived. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Nebraska has experienced a significant number of wildfires the past couple of years, including the second highest year on record in 2022. In a rural state like mine, where nearly 94% of the fire departments are entirely volunteer-run, programs like the Volunteer Fire Assistance Program are crucial. The Nebraska Forest Service helped hundreds of fire districts in my state, 475 in 2022 alone, improve their ability to prepare for and suppress wildfires. While I understand that this program did receive some infrastructure bill funding, I was disappointed to see the program level funded in your FY24 budget request, along with other important programs like the State Fire Assistance Program. Given the increased threat that wildfires pose and the resources needed by these communities like those in Nebraska, can you discuss how that decision was made to level that funding?
I cannot, Senator, tell you what went into the decision to level that funding. What I can tell you, though, is that as we look at many places like Nebraska, and certainly Nebraska, there are many other opportunities where we are working with the state, National Association of State Foresters, and in this case, your state forester, looking at other programs that we work through the state, with the state, to look at reducing the fire opportunities throughout. Now, if you have a particular area, then I would address that specifically, but I'm not familiar enough with Nebraska and what we are doing specifically there, but I'd be certainly happy to work with you and to look further into this.
We have tens of thousands of acres of Forest Service land, probably unusual from the Oregon land that they have because ours are grasslands. And they are sparsely populated area. So the Forest Service is very, very dependent upon neighbors for ranchers to come in and help control those fires. Because as you can imagine, in the sandhills of Nebraska, in the grasslands that we have, when we're suffering drought, as we have been for several years, when the winds are blowing, when you have fires started, they don't just remain on forest land. Right. They cover miles and miles and miles of acres. And so our volunteer fire departments are essential to helping to control fires that are on federal lands as well. So I hope you could get back to us on why we're not seeing an increase in the funding to help those volunteer fire departments. That would be helpful for us.
Certainly.
Thank you. In your written testimony, you highlighted the FY24 request for $72 million across several areas of the Forest Service for zero-emission vehicles and charging infrastructure. When you think of all the challenges that are facing the Forest Service, do you think that electric vehicles and charging infrastructure should really be an area that federal funds are prioritized for?
So, from my experience, Senator, we try and serve the American people. And what we have noticed is that more and more people are buying electric cars than are visiting the national forest. And the ideal that you would be able to visit the national forest and not worry about whether you need to charge your car to get back home, it's an opportunity for us to try and respond to that part of America. And so that's the ideal there. Now, looking at the funding itself, it's for the infrastructure as well as for the vehicles themselves. And I believe the federal government is looking at what are the opportunities to look at having some of our federal vehicles that are electric to look at this greener environment. So there's a lot of reasons to want to support that.
With all due respect, sir, I'd point out that the first two programs that I mentioned were to help and prevent wildfires.
Yes.
I believe your duty is to properly manage the land that is held by the federal government and be able to, as I said, manage it and manage it properly. When we looked at those other two programs dealing with managing wildfires, which I pointed out in my area can whip up in dry conditions devastating wildfires across grassland and across private land as well. But yet we saw level funding or a decrease in funding in your budget request for that. I'm appalled by that. I respect the tough decisions that you have to make on where funds are allocated, but when you look at $72 million requested for EVs and charging infrastructure, while only $21 million is being requested to assist these volunteer fire departments that are vital in wildfire suppression, that does give me pause. And I will continue to advocate for more funding for programs that truly are able to take care of the land that the federal government has. We're looking at 97% of Nebraska's land that is privately owned. So when we have partnerships with our Forest Service, the state foresters, and local landowners, that's, to me, extremely important in keeping that land healthy and keeping that land productive. The Nebraska Forest Service was able to help over 1,300 landowners receive educational or technical assistance in 2022. So that's over 40,000 acres that are now covered by new or revised forest stewardship plans, and 33,000 of those acres are identified as important forest research areas. So I was glad to be able to see the President's budget request ask for a slight increase in that funding to $14 million. As I said, my job, I think, is to be able to focus on the land and the care of that vital resource that the federal government has control over. So I do thank you for that request. My time is up, but if I could submit a question for the record. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Could you let us know how that program, which I just referenced, would help private landowners to develop management plans, and what you see as the importance in your decision-making and making that slight increase in funding? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding this, what is a very important hearing, and thank you for being here, Chief Moore. Montana, we rely on access to our national forests to help drive a $7 billion outdoor recreation economy. It is critically important because it employs a lot of people. I'm in agriculture, and I am proud of the fact that agriculture is the #1 industry, but it could be argued, and pretty effectively, quite frankly, the outdoor recreation is the #1 issue, and our public lands rely on that. Our forests, our watersheds, the collaborative relationships with your agency, with partners, and the responsibility to manage timber drive the economy of many towns in Montana. And our communities rely on your agency to protect watersheds, shield them from the worst impacts of wildfire. And I do look forward to hearing how the Forest Service is going to do that, but I want to talk a little bit about categorical exclusions for a second. How do you see, Congress gave you categorical exclusions, how do you see the Forest Service using those?
We're using them quite extensively, Senator,
Okay, for
a range of projects, whether it's primarily within the timber arena. We're certainly using categorical exclusions there. We also have the ability to look at, particularly where we have the emergency landscapes, to use some of the emergency authorities that has been granted to us. So the Secretary has given me the authority as Chief to look at using the emergency authorities on projects within those high fire sheds.
So I would say by your description you gave right now, that would be congressional intent. That's how I believe categorical exclusions should be used too. Unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately with the strongest of terms, a categorical exclusion was used not to cut trees or not to prevent forest fires, but to allow a corporation to set up in our forested lands, in our national forests, a facility that would include a lot of potential devastating impacts. And it was done using a categorical exclusion, which means no public input. Could you tell me why that was done that way?
Well, categorical exclusion doesn't mean there's no public input. Categorical exclusion means that generally the issues are not of a significant nature to warrant an environmental assessment, an EA, or a environmental impact statement.
Very good point. They didn't think it would have to have an environmental impact what criteria did they use on that to allow a corporation to come into Montana to set up and this was in the Sealy area, to set up a huge recreation resort. And I can tell you unequivocally, the people were not heard, and decisions were made by the Forest Service, by folks on the ground, without taking public input. And if the people wouldn't have stood up and said, foul, this is baloney, this project would have been built using a categorical exclusion, by the way, that was meant for cutting trees, not for recreational purposes. At least that's why I believe a categorical exclusion was put in.
So, Senator, I will look into this and get back with you, but you can use categorical exclusion for more than just cutting trees.
I gotcha.
Okay.
The question is that congressional intent? And I'm going to tell you that I would never, ever, ever have voted for a categorical exclusion for the purpose of making some corporation rich off our public lands. Never happen. Never going to happen. But if you want to use it to protect the community due to wildfire, now that's why you have a categorical exclusion. And that's the point I'm trying to make here, is that I think, I'll be honest with you, I'm not saying it was you, but you're the boss, so you got to take the heat for everybody below you. But I think somebody said they found a loophole here and they cut a deal. And the government should never be cutting a deal. They should be listening to the people on the ground, because it's really important, especially in a state like Montana, where our national forests are so critically important to our economy in a number of different ways, both recreation and through wood products. And so I want you to go out and find out. This has been something that has given government a bad name. And it's in the Forest Service's lap, and folks need to step up and say, look, and I think they have, but not without, it would never happen without incredible public input, letters to the editor, town hall public meetings, where, by the way, Democrats, Republicans, Independent, you did a great, I mean, the Forest Service did a great job uniting these folks, which is good. We've got too much division in this country, but this isn't how we should be doing it, okay? And that's the point I'm trying to make. So I appreciate you. Look into this, hold people accountable. Make sure that the folks that are on the ground are listening to people on the ground, because it's really important. Now I want to talk a little bit about fuel mitigation and priority landscapes, which we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars through IGA to proactively address the wildfire crisis because of climate change. It truly is a crisis. I mean, we've got beetle-killed trees, we've got longer and more intense fire seasons. And I appreciate the work that you're doing in the Kootenai, but at the end of the day, we've got tremendous need for hazardous fuel treatments to protect wildland-urban interface, transmission lines, municipal watersheds. And I would ask that how were Montana landscapes with significant WUI municipal watersheds and standing dead trees bypassed in this process, because they were bypassed? So how could that happen?
So they were not bypassed, and this is not the only opportunity that we have to do work in Montana.
Yeah.
We are doing a lot of work in Montana. We'll continue to do work in Montana, Senator. And so we just don't have, as good as the budget is, we don't have the amount of money to go around to everyone and do all of the work that's really needed. And I would agree with you. Montana, but so many other communities, has so much work and so many areas that need attention. And while I would hate to ever say that we can't get everywhere, Senator, we can't go everywhere, but we're gonna try. We are paying attention to Montana. We are doing a lot of work in Montana.
So I would just say this: the bipartisan infrastructure bill that the ranking member and I helped write with 8 other people gave significant money to the Forest Service. And for the forests in Montana, and we have many of them, and you're intimately familiar with them, to be bypassed in this last round of IIJA dollars does not make a lot of sense to me, quite frankly. But I've got, this is I'm looking at it from a Montana point of view. But I would just tell you, I look forward to working with you and the Kootenai and Basin Creek and all sorts of other places to get more hazardous fuel reduction, because I think it's critically important. We've got too many dead trees. I want to thank the chairman for letting me go over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Tester. I know a lot of your forest issues are similar to what we have throughout the West, including Oregon. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I want to discuss the issue of opportunity between the Forest Service and many of our tribes specific to tribal co-management. As you're aware, we had this blueprint for Southeast Alaska that was developed a couple years ago, issued actually April of '21. but it had a lot of actionable priorities, including some strategies to extend to the 19 tribes in the region at more decision-making through tribal management and co-management opportunities, specifically to 638 contracts. We're looking at the Farm Bill moving forward and different initiatives within that measure right now, but we've got a situation with regards to opportunities with 638 contracts that we may need to address some of the language. In the 2018 Farm Bill, it authorized the use of Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Acts agreements, the 638 ISDEA, for a few projects under the Tribal Forest Protection Act. But under this act, tribes are restricted to contracting only for projects on federal lands that, quote, border or are adjacent to the Indian forest or rangeland. So, of course, this doesn't work in Alaska, and it's also restrictive in the lower 48. We've got folks in Alaska, again, that are interested in this. We're going to have a hearing in Indian Affairs this afternoon. It's a roundtable on Farm Bill, but one of the witnesses there, Richard Peterson, who is the president of Tlingit Haida Central Council, is going to be speaking specifically to how the 638 authorities will be important for workforce development, for food security, for increased economic opportunities. They're looking specific to what can be done with regards to tribal management there at Mendenhall Glacier. So there's a lot of interest in this, but we've heard that the 638 contracting needs to be broadened, as well as including some technical assistance. Can you speak to this issue and whether or not you see this as an opportunity?
So, Senator, you described it accurately in terms of what the concerns are and what the issues are under the 2018 Farm Bill. And we would be more than happy to work with you on this issue, looking at potential new Farm Bill.
So do you think then that we need to address this language that limits it to these federal lands that are either bordering or adjacent to? Because it's not, again, it's not just Alaska. It would be throughout the lower 48 where you've got some challenges there.
Yeah, Senator, I think the word that was used specifically there is that they would have to have trust lands that are adjacent to or border national forests. And since my understanding, with the exception of one tribe, there are no trust lands in Alaska. So as you look at the new Farm Bill, that's where we would be happy to work with you going forward on this issue.
Okay, so maybe you can work with us on some of this TA that we're looking for. Okay, I appreciate that. Let me ask back to Southeast here. As you know, pretty much that entire region is thankfully powered by hydropower. It helps with offsetting some of the other high costs that they have right there. But hydropower projects in the region are hard to develop. Of course, the roadless rule makes it even more difficult. One example is Thayer Creek. This is a hydro project that needs limited road development that relies on rights-of-way granted by the Forest Service to access the project. So what we've got going now is we've got state and federal highway funding that's available for the road development, but the funds can't be used for roads with controlled access, which is the very condition that Forest Service requires in order to grant the necessary right-of-way. So it puts everything at an impasse. We need some help working through this because obviously you want to be able to have these, I mean, these are very small hydro projects which are able to take communities off of their present power generation, which is diesel, which is nobody's alternative.
Right.
But yet we've got this impasse. So I don't know, again, if you can give me somebody to help us through this, But if we're going to be looking at a situation where the roadless rule is going to be this wet blanket on top of us, we can't be in a situation where we've got an impasse like this. Would you agree?
Yeah, I certainly would agree, and I can give you someone to work with as we work through that. And let me say, too, though, we recognize that with the federal lands that's in Alaska, that we need to be working across the aisles to make sure that Alaskans have the necessary way of life, if you will, to exist. And so we will look into that. I will give you a point person to work with, or your staff, and we will see what opportunities we may have to pursue.
Okay, well, we don't want a project like that to be the poster child for what most would look at and say, there's a common sense, straightforward solution here to getting communities off diesel power generation, and it's our own policies that are blocking or impeding that. As we're talking about opportunities within Southeast, we've got one project there that it again kind of defies understanding as to why we can't advance something as small as this. The Hoona Indian Association, working with the the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. And this is exactly what these things are designed to do. They've got this idea that they can take the Icy Straits lumber mill, small little lumber mill, to handle young growth, to establish locally sourced lumber for housing and a housing manufacture facility there in Hoona. So super small scale, but basically designed to get a little bit of product to meet the housing issues that the chairman has noted are just very, very problematic, and certainly within this region. The bipartisan infrastructure bill provided $400 million for financial assistance to facilities that use ecosystem restoration byproducts. It's exactly what we're talking about here. So I'm not asking you to put your finger on the scale, but projects like what we're talking about in Hoona, the Icy States project, would seem to me are just tailor-made for what we're talking about with that program. So I'm hoping that Forest Service could potentially look to projects like this. And again, if what we're trying to address are some of the housing needs in the area, we have the opportunity for locally sourced product there. What more can we be doing working with Forest Service and USDA for projects just like this? It's not only the housing, it is the jobs that come associated with a small mill project like this.
You know, Senator, while I'm not familiar with this particular project, I am familiar and I am aware that there are many small communities, particularly small rural communities in Alaska, that is having challenges to affordable housing. And the conversation that you're bringing is one that I think we need to have. You know, what are the opportunities we have to really address this whole affordable housing issue? And while I don't have the answers yet, I'd be keenly interested in working with you or your staff to see what flexibility we might have to look at addressing this issue, because I think that if we can come up with a solution, it's more widespread than Alaska. So I'm very interested in seeing what's possible. And if we can move the dial a little bit on this issue, I'm in for it 100%.
Mr. Chairman, I have two more quick ones, but I will defer to you if you're going to go forward with more rounds.
I'll go ahead and do my final
Okay,
two
go
and then
ahead.
turn it back to you. Chief Moore, the budget proposes to move the hazardous fuels program from the National Forest System account to the Wildland Fire Management account. And yet if I turn the clock back a few years, the request was the reverse. And Given that year-round wildfire is becoming the norm, it's difficult to understand how fuels projects would be completed if firefighters are routinely called up for wildfire duty. Can you just comment on this philosophical change that would be involving returning the fuels return to wildland fire management?
So, Senator, I think, you know, you're hitting on something that puzzles me as well. We've gone back and forth on this issue, and each time we've gone back and forth, we've had really good rationale for making that decision. And I do believe that no matter which way you go here, there's good rationale for it. One of the things that I support is putting it back into the NFS side, because when you look at prescribed burning as an example, it's about more than just the firefighters. We have a large militia part of the workforce that are qualified and certified to do the different fire activities. And so I think we have to look at how do we continue to cross-integrate all of our employees into an area that we're trying to increase a lot of growth in, and that's prescribed burning. When we look at the wildfire crisis strategy, we say we need to do a couple of things. One, we need to go in and do a lot of forest thinning, and after the thinning, we need to run a prescribed burn through it. The bootleg fire is one of those examples where we hold up as a model for how we should treat the landscape to really get at this wildfire crisis issue. And I don't know if you've seen the poster or not, but it's 3, and it's a really good display of the different treatment methods or versus non-treatment methods. What helps us most is our what we call ADs, administrative determined employees, but also our non-firefighter workforce who has a lot of skill sets to make that happen.
Well, I can see the argument both ways, and we'll continue in that discussion. Certainly the idea that many folks do, it is appropriate for them to move into forest management work when they're not fighting fires suggests one direction. Your point that these are 2 separate functions, one and sometimes separate training in which you're doing the work to prevent fires versus fighting fires is the other, and it's clear that that argument is going back and forth. Northwest Forest Plan revisions. I understand the Forest Service intends to establish a federal advisory committee to advise and recommend revisions to current management plan. And we were asked to nominate individuals. I've nominated several. Can you tell me when the committee will be formally seated to begin work on this important planning process?
Yes, we've just finished up our part of that nomination, and we've sent it over to the Secretary's office for him to make the final decision.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had mentioned in my last question there, Chief, the Southeast Alaska Sustainable Strategy. $25 million spent so far, and it's always described as, quote, an initial investment. So I don't know if you have any update for me on what more might be included. Will those funds be targeted towards long-term economic sustainability? It kind of ties into my question about the Huna modular housing and manufactured lumber proposal. You know, maybe something like this, again, could be part of what you're thinking about in terms of the Southeast Alaska Sustainable Strategy.
Yeah, I don't have any information at this point, Senator, but I would be happy to follow up with you to go into a little bit more specifics on the, we call it, I guess, the SAS.
All right. I'd look forward to that. I had an opportunity to meet with some folks from the Southeast Alaska Economic Council, and part of AML, Alaska Municipal League, talking about exactly the initiatives that would be available through the sustainability strategy. So there's a lot of interest in knowing, all right, what comes next? Because if what you're saying is that you're going to take the entire Tongass off limits when it comes to economic activity because of application of the roadless rule, and you're saying $25 million is it? If we're talking initial investment, which is what the administration had indicated, then let's talk about what comes after the initial investment. So I'd like to have more conversation with your team about that. I do want to thank you for your assistance in finalizing the Chugach region land study. Appreciate that. As always, there's always one more thing to do after that. So I'm hoping that we can count on the same kind of can-do working relationship on the Chugach land exchange proposal. It may end up requiring legislation. The hope is that we can reach agreement on the contours of the exchange in the coming year. So I just really ask for your commitment to work with me and Chugach to make this a reality.
Absolutely, yes.
Good, good. I thank you for that. And then a project that I have been interested in, and believe me, there's a lot of excitement about the prospects for the Alaska Long Trail. This is a 500-mile trail to connect between Seward and Fairbanks. A portion includes the southern trek of the Iditarod in the Chugach, but a lot of our small communities are excited about this. The businesses that depend on tourism and outdoor recreation are excited about that. So as we do have portions of the trail that cross Forest Service lands, just looking for a commitment to work with me to maintain and improve the recreation opportunities within this exciting project.
Yes, we're committed to working with you and particularly looking at improving recreational opportunities.
Good, good. And then last point is the thanks for what we're doing there, particularly in the Tongass, but the Chugach as well, with regards to public use cabins. Again, very, very popular in the region. This came to my attention because the cabins were being destroyed or were removed if they needed maintenance instead of allowing for a more cooperative effort. So the $20 million that was included within the bipartisan infrastructure bill is important. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to provide us a little bit more of a plan, a detailed plan, so we can share with people in the region what the status of those public use cabins will be going forward.
Yes, we'll be happy to provide that to you.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you, Chief Moore. Obviously, a lot of responsibilities that end up affecting many different communities and many different forests, and look forward to continuing the partnership and working with you and your team. Any final comments you would like to make? Oh, well, here we are, seconds from the gavel was just coming down.
I thought he was safe.
Well, Senator, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I know the chief thought he was in great shape, all done. I know he had mastered all the questions just right. But one of the things I want to start with, and I'm pleased, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for allowing me to ask my questions. We're unique in terms of the Forest Service in that we have the grasslands in North Dakota. And it's very important that you come out and see them because, just to get an understanding, because it is different than traditional forests, obviously. But also, I think it's incredibly important for the people that live and work and ranch out there, and because we have the multiple uses out there, everything from, of course, ranching, but also incredible energy development, like the Ranking Member is very involved with. But also tourism and other things as well. So I'd like to ask you to work with us to bring you out of course, now it's spring, so, we haven't quite gotten rid of winter yet, but we're getting to a real nice time of year, and I'd very much like you to come out. And it's not only important in terms of your understanding of the grasslands, but also the folks out there need to see you.
Yeah.
And know that you're finding out what's going on and listening to them. So that's kind of a long invitation, but I'd like you to come out to North Dakota with us and spend some time in the grasslands.
Senator, could I say that I would love to come out to North Dakota, and you may be pleased to know that I used to live in North Dakota.
No way. Did you say that to every member that you used to live in their state? Or?
I started my career in North Dakota, in Dickinson, Lakota, lived that whole area. So I contoured North Dakota. I was just out there about 6 weeks ago as well.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. But I'm very fond of North Dakota. It used to be my home.
Well, that's great. Then you know how to get there. And you'll be welcomed, and it really is important that it makes such a difference in terms of the folks that live and work out there. As you know, having been out there, one of the things that we worked on is we've really worked to secure some funding and find ways to bring the grazing associations together with the counties and the townships and your folks, the Forest Service folks, state of North Dakota, in an effort to make improvements out there. And that's a bit of a challenge because some folks want improvements for ranching, some folks want improvements for tourism, and you know, so there's a natural tug and pull there. And we have set up a working committee to kind of oversee some of the funding that we've put together for that, which includes both federal, state, and local funding. And so are you willing to commit to work with us on that?
Yes, I am, absolutely.
Good. And see, that just dovetails very well with a trip out there. Staffing, how are you doing on your, I know you have real challenges on staffing. How are you doing there? How can we be helpful?
So, you know, it's a really great question. I'll give you an idea of the staff. And last year, we hired about 3,500 employees, but we lost 2,700 through attrition. And so all of that hiring, we only netted about 800 in terms of capacity. And so we're seeing that. We don't know how much of a trend that is, but we're going back out again to advertise for about 2,500 additional employees to see if we can't look at getting our capacity up to really look at implementing the wildfire crisis strategy, but also to look at implement other parts of the program like Great American Outdoor Act funds as well as IRA and BILL funds.
Okay. And you feel you're going to make some progress?
I do feel that we'll make progress, yes.
The other thing I want to ask you, the Joint Chiefs Program. So Senator Bennett and I, on a bipartisan basis, have legislation, and it's really provides for this coordination, I think, out there. And in respect to fire, for example, as well as your, you know, the landscape restoration. Actually, we called our legislation the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership Act. But again, it's about, you know, the kind of a joint effort out there. Because, again, there's different ideas in terms of if you're really tourism-focused in some of those groups, they want a certain approach. And then our grazers need another approach. And so that was really the effort behind the Joint Chiefs legislation that Bennett and I have. So talk a little bit how that works, and particularly in regard to fire resilience, as well as the, you know, the landscape restoration and maintenance and so forth.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that Secretary Vilsack has insisted that USDA operate as one. That fits quite nicely with the Joint Chiefs projects. My colleague, Chief Cosby for NRCS, and I, we have regular meetings to look at opportunities to have Joint Chief projects. So we just looked at a round of projects just not too long ago to fund. And I don't have at my fingertips the number of projects or the location of them yet, but we do feel that this is an opportunity to really work across boundaries, to look at both federal, state, and private lands, trying to improve the work there, particularly those areas that have been affected by fire, or disease, and insects, and some of those types of problems.
And you would be supportive of reauthorization of the Joint Chiefs Program in the Farm Bill?
Yes.
And the other thing we do a lot of is we're doing a lot with unmanned aerial systems, unmanned. And so in terms of you know, the grasslands, fire suppression, fire management, any thoughts on using some of that new technology? But then also are you really committed to work again with the ranchers out there? Because, the control burdens and that kind of thing can be a real problem if you're not coordinating closely. And, most of the emergency response out there is volunteer.
Yeah, so we are really moving into using the drones for a lot of different purposes. Fire is one of those purposes, but just looking at natural resource management, we're looking at how can we use drones more. We currently have about 100 employees that have been certified for drones, and we're going to continue to look in that arena and to expand our opportunities to utilize that type of equipment. We do believe that that is the future, and we really want to lean into it.
And close coordination with the people on the land out there on fire.
Absolutely, close
management.
coordination.
Thanks, Chief. Appreciate it very much. And again, thanks to the chairman and ranking member.
Thank you, Senator. You timed it just perfectly. If there are no other statements, and I don't think there are, the hearing record will be open until the close of business on April 5th, 2023. Thank you very much, Chief Moore. This hearing is adjourned.